Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Well, yesterday was Ukrainian Independence Day, and so I wanted to check in with a gentleman that is an expert on what's been going on in Eastern Europe. He is someone I spoke with right before the attack by Russia on Ukraine, and he warned that it was going to happen when lots of people were thinking it wasn't going to happen. And I've spoken with him since on several occasions. Marcus Kolga is his name. He's a writer. He's a communication strategist. He's a human rights and disinformation expert, and he is a principal with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Marcus, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on, Brian.
So tell me what the significance of the day is.
Well, we've now just passed the 6-month mark of Vladimir Putin's barbaric invasion against Ukraine. When we first talked about this invasion 6 months ago, and I think it was the week after the invasion, you'll recall that Vladimir Putin told the world that this would be a 3-day special operation to denazify Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, has a Jewish Ukrainian president, so the notion that the government is being run by Nazis is an absurd one. But the fact that he thought that this would take 3 days to conquer Ukraine, to take over its capital, Kiev, that's not happened. Things have not gone even remotely as planned for Vladimir Putin. He has made marginal gains in eastern Ukraine, in the south of Ukraine. He has spent the past 6 months targeting Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, hospitals, schools, homes, shopping malls. He has targeted refugees that are fleeing Ukraine, and he's abducted many of them. There was a report that just came out recently that stated that upwards of 1.6 million Ukrainians have been deported by Russian authorities to remote areas of Russia where they're forced to engage in essentially slave labor.
1.6 million?
1.6 million Ukrainian civilians. Wait for this, though. Wait for this number. The U.S. State Department, Anthony Blinken, stated just a few weeks ago that 260,000 children have been abducted from various Ukrainian orphanages and have been torn from their families. 260,000 children. Now, a report that just came out 2 days ago stated that the Russian, and actually this wasn't just a report, Russian state media commentators suggested that those children who have been abducted from Ukraine should be trained in military operations and sent back to Ukraine. This is the kind of war, barbaric war, that we're seeing Russia engage in. And, this is the damage that's being caused over the 6 months has been incredible. Not only do we have all these abducted Ukrainians, not only have we had all this infrastructure destroyed, there are over 12 million Ukrainians that have been displaced because of this war. Many of them have come to this country. And the cost of all of this is running up into the hundreds of billions of dollars, the reconstruction of Ukraine. Who's going to pay for this? This is a big question. Ukraine certainly doesn't have that money because it's spent the past 6 months defending itself from Russian attacks. So there are a lot of questions. There are a lot of concerns. The safety of the Ukrainian people is still very much up in the air. There's a threat that is ongoing. And Canada has thankfully stepped up to a certain degree, but I think there's a lot more that we can do and that our allies can do to make sure that we stop Vladimir Putin right now.
You talk about this 1.2 million people being
1.6.
1.6, I apologize, million people being taken to Russia to work in slave labor, effectively. I thought, even if you believe Putin's, propaganda, that he was there to sort of protect Russian-speaking people. Are these Ukrainian-speaking people that he's doing this to, or Russian-speaking people? And does it, I guess, matter?
I'm not sure that it matters. I mean, these are people that a lot of them were trying to flee cities like Mariupol. We saw Mariupol get essentially turned into rubble by Russian forces earlier on in the war. Refugees who were fleeing Mariupol often had to navigate through various different checkpoints. And there are widespread reports that at those checkpoints, those civilians who were trying to flee were were nabbed. They were detained and put into holding camps, then onto trains and transported off into distant corners of Russia. This isn't, whether they're Ukrainian speakers or Russian speakers or, English speakers, French, it doesn't matter. These are people who were taken against their will to Russia, and 1.6 million of them.
But his whole propaganda was that he was trying to denazify Ukraine away from people that were discriminating against Ukrainian speakers, and that this was against Russian speakers, and that part of, if not all of Ukraine historically was Russian, and the Russian speakers were Russian, and he would go in there and protect them, and et cetera, et cetera. And I've interviewed some people from some of those eastern cities that used to speak Russian that are refusing to speak Russian anymore. And so, like, you go back to, we talked about sort of historical examples.
Yeah.
When Hitler invaded Austria, he was trying to, he would argue, protect German-speaking people, and maybe he did some of that. Is Putin's just trying to destroy every Ukrainian, whatever their language is, whatever their historical genealogy is, it would appear.
Yeah, it would appear that what Vladimir Putin is hell-bent on, first of all, it's the reconstruction of the Soviet Union, but it is the destruction of Ukrainian culture, its language, and the assimilation of those people. And those Ukrainians or Russians who are unwilling to identify themselves or assimilate themselves as Russians, as Vladimir Putin's Russians, they're going to be destroyed. It's very clear. This is the kind of war that Vladimir Putin is engaging in. And you're very much correct in drawing that analogy with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. I mean, this is what we're seeing right now is a neo-Nazi, a psychopathic neo-Nazi totalitarian regime that is going berserk, engaging in all sorts of atrocities against a peaceful European nation. And you mentioned the word liberate. This is exactly what Vladimir Putin has been telling his own people and pretending to tell the world, is that he is liberating the people of Ukraine themselves from its neo-Nazi regime. Again, I want to underscore the fact that the Ukrainian government is led by a Ukrainian Jewish president. There is no neo-Nazi government in Ukraine. It is a democratically elected government that runs that country. But this is an old narrative that the Russians have been using for over 100 years. Last Tuesday, we marked the 83rd anniversary of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And for your listeners who aren't familiar with that, this was an agreement that was signed on August 23rd, 1939, between Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin. That agreement allowed them to carve up Central and Eastern Europe between them, and enabled the coordinated start of the Second World War. Now, towards the end of the war in 1944, Joseph Stalin reoccupied much of Central and Eastern Europe and claimed to be liberating it. And indeed, Russian forces did eliminate the Nazi threat in Europe, just like the Allied forces did in Western Europe. The big difference here is that whereas the Western forces, once those countries, France, Western Germany, Holland, Belgium, were liberated, they engaged in a process of rebuilding them and making sure that they could stand on their own as sovereign democracies. Whereas Joseph Stalin, when he liberated much of Central and Eastern Europe, he engaged in much of the same tactics as we're seeing Vladimir Putin engage in today: mass deportations, systematic rape, terror. And those countries of Central and Eastern Europe, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine among them, were subjected to this for another 50 years. For those countries, the war didn't end until 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Vladimir Putin has taken all of those same tactics, the terrorizing of his own people, but specifically the Ukrainian people, and calling those people that he is murdering, he's claiming to liberate them. That is the biggest lie that Vladimir Putin has so far engaged in with this war. Thankfully, most Western people and Western governments don't believe him. But this is unfortunately a lie that many of his own people do in Russia. And that's why they have continued to enable this war over the past 6 months.
I'm going to come back after the message and ask you how and why, because you're also an expert on disinformation. We're going to take a quick break for some messages and come back more with Marcus Kolga on Ukrainian Independence Day and understand a little bit more about what's actually going on 6 months into this war. Stay with us, everybody. Okay. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga. He is an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe. He's a human rights activist. He's a columnist. He's a writer. He's a communication strategist. He's a human rights advocate. And he's a very smart and very nice guy. And I've had the pleasure of chatting with him a few times and meeting with him a few times. You're a disinformation expert, which, you know what, I never realized up until I met you that there were experts in disinformation. And so I got to ask you, how is he selling this to the Russian people? Up until recently, we were doing business with Russia. We had this McDonald's concept that if people both had McDonald's restaurants, they wouldn't go to war with each other, that capitalism was spreading across the world, that, they were part of the, I guess it was, 10 years ago, but they were part of the G8. What's happened? How is he fooling, convincing, lying to his people?
Well, that's a great question, Brian. Going back to the 1990s, you're absolutely right. I think there was general hope that even though Russia looked a bit like the Wild West, that there was still hope that democratic values would find their roots eventually and blossom, and that Russia would become a modern, democratic, stable, Western-style democracy. That choice and that opportunity disappeared in 2000. Boris Yeltsin, the former president of Russia, had basically two choices back in 1998 and 1999. He could have chosen a gentleman named Boris Nemtsov to become his successor. Boris Nemtsov was a Democrat, a human rights activist, and the polar opposite of Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin, of course, was the opposite choice. Vladimir Putin promised to protect Yeltsin's family, who had engaged in fairly significant and not surprisingly insignificant corruption, and was the KGB's man and candidate for the position. Yeltsin went with him, and quite frankly, things started going downhill in this direction already 22 years ago on New Year's Eve in 2000, when Boris Yeltsin announced that Vladimir Putin would be his successor. And starting at that time, there was a crackdown on journalists. A number of prominent journalists were assassinated. Anna Politkovskaya, who exposed the truth about Vladimir Putin's war in Chechnya, she was gunned down in her apartment building. There were a number of other high-profile assassinations of whistleblowers, and so this is how this crackdown began. Putin raided a number of independent television stations, took those into the state. The state, of course, is Vladimir Putin. So, through those 22 years, he managed to control the media, silence independent outlets, opposition activists like Boris Nemtsov, who was a very good friend of mine. Boris Nemtsov, of course, who called for democratic reform in Russia, was gunned down just steps from the Kremlin in February of 2015. Other opponents have been poisoned. Alexei Navalny, I think most of your listeners will have heard his name. He is an anti-corruption activist. He was poisoned 2 years ago. Vladimir Kara-Murza, another prominent opposition activist, poisoned twice and arrested in Moscow last April. And he now faces 10 years in jail just for criticizing Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine and for calling it a war. And right now, in fact, in Russia, there are thousands of political prisoners who have been charged with criticizing the war in Ukraine. So criticism of the Putin regime or the war in Russia is a very dangerous business. And Vladimir Putin, through various different tactics, has managed to silence his own people. And anyone in Russia who might otherwise criticize the war has been intimidated into silence. That's how Vladimir Putin controls the narrative in his own country.
In World War II, once again, going to the historical example, the German people stuck by Hitler right into the end, it would appear, still sending people to the front constantly. However, there were some, particularly in the professional ranks of the army, that tried to assassinate him and objected and tried to stand up to him. Don't you think there's anyone in Russia, in Moscow, in government that actually realized that this is nuts?
I think that we need to wait and make sure that we sustain our sanctions in order to be, for the situation for those oligarchs around Vladimir Putin, for the security men who are also just as corrupt as the oligarchs and Vladimir Putin himself, for them to start feeling the pressure personally. There was a poll that just came out recently, just about 2 days ago, that stated that the majority of Russians are actually quite concerned about the impact of sanctions. Russians right now, I mean, if they want to buy, the wealthier Russians, especially the oligarchs and the security people, if their wives want to go and buy a fancy handbag or a dress, they need to fly to Dubai to do so. They can't do so on the streets of Moscow anymore. Middle-class Russians, middle to upper-class Russians, the ones that can afford a Big Mac, can't buy a Big Mac anymore. They're buying cheap knockoffs of whether it's Coca-Cola or any other major Western brand. Life is becoming uncomfortable for Russians. And it has to get to the point where the Russian people themselves, whether it's the security people or the oligarchs, but most importantly, the Russian people, when they look in the mirror and they look at their situation and they ask, how on earth did we get here? Things certainly could be much better. And when they come to the realization that all of this, the fact that Vladimir Putin has failed to deliver on any real domestic reforms for 22 years, the fact that he's dragging Russia back into the Brezhnev Soviet era, once they come to that realization, they may brave the possible repressions and come out to the streets and demand change. And so we recently read about and heard about an assassination of a young woman named Daria Dugina. This is the daughter of a Russian white supremacist neo-Nazi who has formed the basis of much of the ideology that Vladimir Putin believes in. That you could call it Putinism. This person was the daughter of this philosopher was killed just a few nights ago. And there was an organization. Now, there's so much speculation about who may have killed her, but there's an organization that is identifying itself as the Russian National Republican Army, a potential partisan group that is claiming responsibility for it and claiming responsibility for some other acts, we'll call them terrorist acts, over the past few months. If this is true, Vladimir Putin needs to be concerned because that uprising may already be happening if this organization does in fact exist and is responsible for that bombing, because this will be if they do exist, this is just the first such attempt on a close Putin associate on the attempt on their lives. And there's others that will surely follow.
Putin is claiming that it's a Ukrainian nationalist female that had come across the border 4 months ago and was trailing her or something like that. And so he's blaming Ukraine.
I think that everyone sort of expected him to blame Ukraine, and then use that as a justification to crack down or potentially intensify the operations against Ukraine, maybe send some missiles into Kiev. The first point I would say is that strategically, this is not this type of target that Ukraine would focus on. It's not strategic. They would have to put in a lot of resources, risk a lot to do it. Including potential repercussions. It just wouldn't be strategically worth it for Ukraine to do it. And all of the evidence since then, this woman who they've identified, apparently her boyfriend or her husband is very much involved with the pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine. So that's also makes it very peculiar. The fact that she crossed the border from eastern Ukraine into Russia with a 12-year-old daughter makes absolutely no sense. This is not how special ops work or intelligence officers work. They don't drag 12-year-old kids along with them. And the documents that were published by the Russian authorities that seem to they're using to claim that she was part of the Ukrainian National Defense Forces. All of these have been proven by forensic scientists and open source investigators to be completely forged. There are tools, very simple tools, online tools that can be used to analyze them, and they're all cheap Photoshop cut and paste jobs. And the final piece of evidence is that the Estonian authorities have no record of this person crossing into Estonia, because the Russians, of course, want to drag another a NATO partner into this. So they've claimed that this Ukrainian agent fled to Estonia after killing Dugina. But the Russian government has not produced any sort of evidence to demonstrate that she crossed the border. They have cameras all over the place. So what this all really says, it proves the incompetence of Russian intelligence. If this really was a Ukrainian, then how did they allow this to happen? I mean, they have cameras everywhere. Their intelligence claims to be among the best in the world. If that's true, it demonstrates the complete incompetence of the Russian intelligence and Russian authorities. But I don't believe it's true. I think they've obviously blamed Ukraine simply to escalate their violence towards that country and deflect blame from the real causes.
Marcus, the report I read in the New York Times this past weekend was that the U.S. estimates there's 80,000 Russian soldiers that have been killed in this war so far. That's got to have an impact when the results, when the feedback, when the information gets back to the parents and the siblings and the communities back home, doesn't it? And then I also heard the statistic that something like 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative in Russia. And so that there's got to be a fair amount of, communication going back and forth across the border. Like, aren't the regular people finding out what's happening?
Well, look, going back to our, the previous question about how Vladimir Putin is able to sell this war to his people. I mean, he has complete control over the information environment. This is Orwell's 1984 that Russians are living in, where peace has become war. He controls the minds of the vast majority of Russians. There's no information that otherwise gets in. And I've also read those accounts of Ukrainians calling their relatives in Russia to try to explain to them what's happening, and they simply won't believe it. That is how powerful Vladimir Putin's propaganda machine is. So, this is something that we need to contend with, and we need to understand that, the Russian people, going back to your earlier question about the German people, the Russian people are, to a certain degree, even though they've been brainwashed, just as, many Germans were by Nazi propaganda, the Russian people are also, to a certain degree, complicit in this war. And, a number of our allies, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland as well, have started the process of restricting travel visas for Russians coming into their country. First of all, is the moral justification. How can you allow upper class wealthy Russians to travel to your country when 12 plus million Ukrainians have been displaced from their homes? Their homes have been destroyed. There are atrocities happening all the time. How can we allow Russians to simply travel freely to these countries? And this is also, in addition to the sanctions, is apparently putting considerable pressure on the Russian government. So this is something that I think that we need to start thinking about as well, is eventually holding the Russian people to account for this, because eventually, there will have to be a reckoning. And I think that the Russian people need to understand that they are also, if they're going to believe in this propaganda, that they're also going to be held to account if they don't hold their own leaders to account.
We're chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga, who is an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe and Ukraine right now. He's actually talking to us from a library in what, the Estonian consulate? Is that correct?
It's Tartu College. It's an Estonian academic facility at the corner of Spadina and Bloor in Toronto.
Completely appropriate. Thank you for that. We're going to take a break, and I'm going to come back and I'm going to ask Marcus about some of the economic issues that have come up of late. He's commented on LNG facilities, on the grain shipments, etc. And just on the reports that GDP is down like 4 or 5% in Russia already. Stay with us. We're going to be back in just 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Yesterday was the celebration of the independence of Ukraine, and so I thought it would be completely appropriate to do a show on where we are right now with the Russian war in Ukraine, and I wanted to reach out to Marcus Kolga, who is a writer, a communication strategist, a human rights expert, and a disinformation expert, which is what we've just been talking about. He also is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And I wanted to talk, Marcus, a little bit for a couple of minutes on some of the economic issues. You posted recently that you had been arguing for the development of Canadian liquid LNG, liquefied natural gas for a while, infrastructure on the East Coast to ship to Europe to displace some of the Russian energy, and really, support Europe, Central Europe, Germany particularly, getting away from Russian supplies. Where do you think of the situation right now where Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, has met with the Chancellor recently and effectively in a news report come out and said that we can't help?
Well, look, I think that the meeting between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, I think the expectation on the German side, as well as those of us who are observers and experts on what's happening in Russia and certainly in Central and Eastern Europe, the expectation was that the Chancellor was going to ask Canada to increase its liquefied natural gas exports to Europe, and to help, as you mentioned, alleviate the Russian dominance of the European gas market. That didn't happen, and I think a lot of people were shocked. I'm not sure if the German government was shocked about that, but I don't think that the Prime Minister outright rejected the idea, but he stated that there's no business case for this, and that's quite frankly not true. As you mentioned, I already wrote about the opportunity for Canada to enter the European market, and clearly generate revenues for Alberta and our gas resource companies, and for Canada itself, but also to help secure European energy supplies. I spoke to a number of national leaders in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. All of them said that Canadian gas would be welcome. It's safe, it's reliable. They would be happy to buy and pay a premium, in fact, for Canadian gas. During the past 6 months, the business case has only intensified. As I mentioned, Germany was very much hopeful that they could rely on Canadian gas. Emmanuel Macron, France's president, about 3 months ago, came out publicly and said he hopes that Canada will increase gas supplies to Europe. That hasn't happened. One of the excuses was that LNG terminals, that's the export terminal where natural gas is taken, it's compressed, it's super cooled to a liquefied state and put on ships. Those facilities are big, they're expensive to build, and it could take 4 to 5 years. Fine, yeah, they do take that long to build, but if we expedite the approvals process, we could get started now. And there's actually US technology right now, brand new technology, that allows for the construction of offshore liquefaction terminals. These terminals, although they don't have the same capacity as land-based ones, these things can be built in under 12 months. If we really wanted to help Europe, we could get the gas through the United States up to the Maritimes and onto ships with these offshore terminals. So, options exist. And it's really unfortunate that, some members of Justin Trudeau's government have simply just buried their heads in the sand, for climate purposes, and have rejected this. We could lend Europe a big hand by providing a boost in that natural gas, and we could, I think our companies would benefit from it as well. So it's really unfortunate that that the announcement didn't come when the Chancellor was here earlier this week.
Let me ask you 2 questions on that, if I could. From a climate change standpoint, to start with, am I right in saying that, yeah, liquefied natural gas would have potentially a negative climate change impact if we ramped up production, but the energy is going to be used anyway, and the energy that's going to be used is either coal and or Russian gas. And the coal is obviously a lot worse for the climate, and the Russian natural gas is significantly less efficient, more climate change negative than Canadian natural gas.
You are absolutely right, and thank you for bringing that up. This is another place where Vladimir Putin is holding us hostage and causing blackmail. It's climate blackmail. Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, France, all of these countries have announced that they are restarting otherwise dormant coal-powered electricity plants. And for how long? This war is not about to end. If those power plants are fueled up, they are going to belch all sorts of nasty and toxic CO2 gases into the atmosphere. By delivering safe natural gas, we are actually helping the climate, not causing more damage to it. So that's a very good point. And when talking about Russian gas, Russia exports all of its gas. One thing that hasn't been reported on during this war is the fact that most of Russia is coal-fired. And so, if we terminate Europe's reliance on Russian gas, maybe they could start using it domestically and shutting off their own coal plants. So there are climate implications for delivering natural gas and not for delivering natural gas to Europe. I think net, our failure to export natural gas will actually harm the climate more than to help it.
I agree with that completely. Second question on this issue. The comment by Trudeau was that there wasn't a business case. I don't believe that. I think there is clearly a business case. It only makes natural sense that there'd be a business case. And a major energy sector executive came out and said there is clearly a business case. The only problem in the business case is lack of confidence in the regulatory framework and getting regulatory approvals. Isn't now, given the justification of supplanting Russian natural gas, the best possible time in history to get those regulatory impediments taken away?
Well, you would think that the government would prioritize this. Of course, you want to make sure that these plants are safe, that the pipelines are safe. But frankly, the pipeline infrastructure is pretty much already in place. When I wrote this fairly long report 3 years ago, I spoke to TransCanada. And they were working on expanding the capacity of those pipelines. They, of course, on the Canadian side, they pretty much terminate in Montreal, dip into the United States, and then they come back up in the Maritimes. I don't think there's any hope to have those any new pipelines transit Quebec, but certainly, we can expand those the pipelines that do exist. We can work with our U.S. partners, but make sure that those applications that are in for permits to build LNG terminals. There's one right now that is being proposed by a Spanish company, Repsol. Let's make sure that gets built. Let's make sure that gets approved. It should be this should be a national security priority, not just a climate priority. This is a national security issue, and so they should be prioritizing this. Why they're not doing that is beyond me. I mean, clearly, I think that climate issues are taking priority, which is also, of course, very important, but foolhardy, I think, and naive in the current circumstances.
I think it's incredible, particularly when I think that both of us agree that even though we may have more of a climate impact in Canada, the global climate impact will be lessened if we supplant Russian energy with Canadian liquefied natural gas. I think because of what we've done to our military over the last decade or two, and our defense spending, et cetera, we have not been able to help out in the war to the extent that we could and should. But we can help out significantly just by making sure that we give backbone to Germany and other European countries by supplying them the energy that they need, particularly as we're coming up to cold winter. So I'm really disturbed by the lack of action on that. Let me turn to another issue, if I could. You've also commented about this Ukrainian-Russian grain deal, and you said the Russians can't be trusted. I understand that, but what do you think we should do? Not ship grain then?
No, I mean, we have to ship grain. There's no doubt about it. Up until a few weeks ago, this Russian blockade of the port of Odessa, it had trapped 22 million tons of grain in Odessa. This is grain that is desperately needed by many countries in North Africa, in the Middle East, and as far away as Asia. And it really did threaten a genuine food crisis, not only in the short term, but in the long term, because the crops that the Ukrainian farmers so bravely sowed as bombs were raining down on them in the late winter and early spring, they wouldn't have any place to put those. And so the 22 million tons of grain that were sitting in those silos it was almost prepared to rot there. Ukrainian farmers were going to burn the crops that they couldn't store anywhere. So there really could have been long-term implications for this crisis that is being caused by Vladimir Putin, not by any sanctions, as Vladimir Putin would want the world to believe. The sanctions that we've placed on Russia have nothing to do with food or grain. Any suggestion that they do is pure Russian disinformation and a Russian information operation. So this deal that was reached between independently with the Ukrainians, the Turks, and the UN, and then on the Russian side also with the Turks and the UN, I think it's welcome. The fact that there are ships that are leaving Odessa's port with grain shipments is a positive thing. They're going to places like Lebanon and Libya and other countries that are so desperately in need of that grain. But you're right. I don't believe that Russia can be trusted. Just 2 days ago, Russia fired missiles on agricultural infrastructure, grain silos in Odessa. Why are you shooting at these silos? This would, one of the points of that agreement was that Russia wouldn't fire on any sort of agricultural infrastructure in the vicinity of Odessa, and they're doing that. And so there's not much recourse for Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is going to continue shipping this grain because it's needed by the world. But Russia will do all it can to impede the delivery of that grain. And it's quite frankly in Russia's interest to create a world food shortage, because then they will try to blame Ukraine and the Western world for that, and in hopes of improving their own standing amongst the developing world. So we need to keep a very close eye on this. And quite frankly, I think that Canada, along with its allies, should be sending the kind of weapons like Harpoon, surface to sea anti-ship missiles to Ukraine in order to deter the Russians from engaging in this sort of activity. The Ukrainians have proven very responsible in their use of the weapons that we've sent them already. There's no reason they wouldn't use those responsibly as well, and it would help secure that grain supply to the parts of the world that need it. It
seems like Putin and Russia has been, in addition to regular terrorism, if that's a word, I don't even know, but has been exploiting energy terrorism and food terrorism as well. It's unbelievable. If people want to follow you, because I've been very impressed with your writings on this topic, what should they do? Should they subscribe to something in the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, or is there a website that they should go to, or what?
Yeah, sure. I mean, if anyone of your listeners are on Twitter, they can follow me at Kolga, or they can follow me at DisinfoWatch. They can also go to our website, disinfowatch.org, to see what's the sort of narratives that Russia is using to fool us and to try and justify its war. And when I write in the Globe and the Star and the Post, a lot of that is often posted to my Twitter feed. So my Twitter feed is probably the best place to get information.
At Kolga.
At Kolga. Very simple.
We're going to take a break and come back with some concluding comments with Marcus Kolga in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's been 6 months since Russia invaded Ukraine in something that Putin said was going to last for 3 days, and he was going to be able to take over Kiev and put in place a puppet government. Marcus Kolga, who is a writer, a communication strategist, a human rights and disinformation expert, someone senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, has been my guest on a couple of different occasions. We spent tonight talking about disinformation, which he's an expert in. We've spent a time talking about some economic issues. But I wonder, to wrap it all up, Marcus, if we can come back to the war. What is happening? What do you think is going to happen? And what should Canada and NATO do?
Look, in the previous segment, you mentioned grain terrorism, food blackmail, energy blackmail. Right now, there's real concern that he may be engaging in nuclear blackmail. There is the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, sort of in south central Ukraine. It's not far from the front lines. There is serious concern that Vladimir Putin may cause some sort of a crisis, and I don't want to say a nuclear meltdown, but could cause a serious issue with that nuclear plant. Blame it on the Ukrainians, blame it on NATO. Pick any one of those you want. He blames NATO and Ukraine on almost everything that happens with Russia. And so this is a very real possibility. So we need to keep a very close eye on that. In the south of Ukraine near Kherson, which is a frontline city right now, it looks like Ukraine is preparing for a counteroffensive. They have effectively destroyed all of the bridges around that city, preventing Russia from reinforcing forces inside of the city and from others escaping. And so this would be a big win for Ukraine. And so I think we need to keep a very close eye on what's going on there. What Vladimir Putin will try to do over the next few months, he is going to try and maintain the status quo. I think we talked about this earlier, that he has had a number of thousands of troops have simply laid down their arms and have basically walked back to Russia. There's fratricide that's happening. Junior officers, soldiers are killing off their superior officers. And the real big problem for Vladimir Putin is the fact that he cannot manufacture new weapons because no one is shipping any of the sort of high-tech parts that he needs for them. And he can't repair the ones that are damaged because he doesn't have the parts. There are reports that were coming out about a month ago that Russian troops were basically taking parts from household appliances, dishwashers, dryers, and such, and using those to repair tanks and whatnot. So things are not going well for Vladimir Putin. The sanctions are starting to hurt. Certainly with regards to military infrastructure, he's not able to regenerate his forces. So whatever he can do to maintain the situation that he's in right now, he's not looking to make any big advances. But if he can draw the war out for another 5-6 months, especially if it's a cold war or cold winter in Europe, Vladimir Putin is hoping to extract some concessions from our allies in Europe and probably Ukraine itself. So I think that's what we should be prepared for. And let's keep our fingers crossed that more military equipment goes to Ukraine and that Ukraine can effectively fight back and push Putin's forces back behind that February 24th front line and regain its territory, and ultimately as well regain the peninsula of Crimea, where they've made some interesting things have been happening over the past few weeks. So that's where we're at, and that's where I think we're going to be headed in the next few months.
NATO has been helpful. Should they do a lot more, or just continue what they've been doing?
I think NATO just has to focus on continuing what it's doing. It has to focus on making sure that the forces that are in countries like Poland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, but those forward presence operations are reinforced, that we increase the number of troops there and certainly the equipment there, and expedite the membership of Sweden and Finland into NATO, and then working with Finland to create that and protect that entire eastern NATO border. That's what we need to be doing. With regards to Ukraine, we've just got to keep sending them those the high-tech weapons that we've sent them, especially the long-range artillery that we've been sending them, to give them that fighting chance.
I think it was the Secretary of Defense in the United States made a provocative statement when he was in, I think it was Poland or something like that a couple months ago, that this war would weaken Russia, so they could never do anything like this again. It's almost as if a quick end, a negotiated end to this war would not be in the American interest, because they wouldn't weaken Russia as much as they want to weaken Russia. Does that make any sense?
You got it. I think that a negotiated end to this war just prolongs these cycles of aggression that Vladimir Putin has engaged in since going back to 2007. The longer he remains in power, the longer this threat remains. He will try to destabilize Europe and the entire Western world. He may be physically at war with Ukraine, but he's at war with us. And like I say, the longer he remains there, the greater, that threat will still remain. So it's in NATO's interest, it's in Canada's interest, it's in Ukraine's interest, it's in the interest of all of our allies to hand Vladimir Putin a humiliating defeat, one that humiliates his armed forces so badly that they eventually turn on Vladimir Putin and remove him from power. This will all end only when Vladimir Putin goes and the security apparatus around him. He needs to go, and that's like I say, that's the only thing that will stop all of this.
Which is what President Biden effectively said and got in so much trouble for admitting the truth.
He was right. He was right.
Okay, last question. You're very connected to the Estonian government, I understand. What's the attitude in Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland today? Do they think they're next, or are they not worried? Yeah,
of course they're worried that they could be next. I'm an Estonian citizen as well, and I look to Ukraine. The battle that Ukraine is in is all of our battle, because if we don't stand up for Ukraine, if Ukraine fails to defend itself, Vladimir Putin may rest for a little while, but he will set his sights on any one of those NATO countries, and it could happen quickly, or non-NATO. Someone like a country like Moldova could be next. But those countries are preparing themselves. It's no holds barred now. They understand the threat that they're under, and they're taking the appropriate steps to make sure that they're defended. Estonia is buying long-range artillery from the United States. They're learning from the Ukrainians, which is one benefit of this war, a silver lining, if it were, is that all of those countries, and Canada included, is learning about how Russia engages in war. And we're learning about the technology that they're using. And I think we're all pretty confident that, if Russia attacks one of the NATO countries, it won't take long for NATO to defeat Russia. So we're taking heart in that. All of those countries are taking heart in that, but they are making those preparations, assuming that Vladimir Putin may target one of them next. But they're standing up, and they're confidently doing so. I was in Estonia at the beginning of June, and I didn't get any sense that there was any sort of imminent danger or that the people were panicking. I think they're fairly confident, and NATO is giving a lot of that confidence to them. So I think that, I think in the long-term prognosis for them with regards to their security is quite good.
Marcus Kolga, expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe, particularly Ukraine today, human rights expert, disinformation expert. Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's Ukrainian Independence Day yesterday. It's a 6-month anniversary, if you can call it anniversary, but of Putin's attack into Ukraine. And I wanted to have Marcus here to focus on Ukraine, because I think the biggest risk is that we all get tired of what's going on in Eastern Europe, sort of maybe the way that we've gotten tired of the pandemic, and we forget how important it is, and we get more worried about our own lives and about inflation and other things that are happening. And we can't. This is a unbelievably important fight. I agree with Marcus. It's a fight between Putin and democracy. It's a fight between Putin and the West. It's a fight between Putin and freedom, and freedom not in in just a democracy standpoint, but freedom of press, freedom of thought, freedom of our abilities to live our lives to the fullest, rather than having a dictator like your Fahrenheit 421 or Orwellian, those kinds of histories. So I think that we've got to continue to pay attention. And we've got to support our governments. And frankly, I think we should all be phoning up Prime Minister Trudeau and saying, build that liquefied natural gas pipeline to the East Coast, because we want to supply Europe so that they don't buy any more Russian gas. Because if that's the least we can do, then we should be doing that. Anyway, Marcus Kolga, thank you so much for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from Estonia and Ukraine, at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody.